Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Giluli, and I'm the Vice President of State Outreach and Engagement here at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And I'm also your host for today's AU Summer Series. We're joining you every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern or 12 p.m. Pacific time to bring you experts and special guests from across the movement for separation of religion and government. Today is the second installment in our summer series, and we're really excited to bring you Katherine Stewart speaking about her new book, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. At Americans United, for more than 70 years, we've been safeguarding our American value of religious freedom for all people. In courts and in Congress and in communities across the country, we work every day to fight for the freedom to practice any religion or no religion at all, so long as we're not harming others. That is the religious freedom found in our Constitution. Before we get started today, I wanted to point you to a few technical features that will make sure you have a great experience. If you're joining us on Zoom today, you can join me in the chat box. I'll be live in the chat box chatting with all of you. And if you have a question for Katherine or for Rob, who will be moderating, please just drop that right into the Q&A box, and Katherine will be taking questions towards the end of our hour together. For those of you who may be joining us on Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rob Boston, and I'll be back to join you at the very end. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. We are very fortunate to have Katherine Stewart with us today. She is the author of this book, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, which I have read and it was featured in Church and State recently. An excellent book. I recommend that to all of you. Katherine also is a contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, The New Republic, and she wrote a book before this one, and also an excellent book called The Good News Club, which was an in-depth investigation of how the religious right is trying to use our public school system to proselytize. In 2014, she was named Person of the Year by Americans United, a well-deserved honor. And she's been a great friend to our organization. She has traveled all over the country, speaking to our chapters where she's always been well received. Her writings and her journalism and investigation are extremely important at this particular point in our history. She will be addressing us this afternoon. And then, as Sarah mentioned, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions later. So Katherine, please take it away.
Thank you so much, David, Sarah, Rob, Rachel Laser, everyone else at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. First of all, I want to acknowledge all of you attending this event for being here. Thank you so much for making the time to connect. We're facing so many challenges at this moment in particular. The struggle for justice is vital and important. And the fact that so many of you have tuned in for this talk, as there are so many issues competing for your time and attention, really gives me hope. We all care deeply about our country and its future. And that's why I'm here today to discuss the threat of religious nationalism in America. I want to talk for about 35 minutes, focusing on some of the most intriguing and unexpected features of the Christian nationalist movement. And then I'm hoping to have plenty of time for questions. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what we saw last week when Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, ordered the violent removal of peaceful protesters so that President Trump could walk from the White House across Lafayette Square to St. John's Episcopal Church to hold up a Bible. So most presidents, having picked up a Bible, take the trouble to read from it. Trump merely took a copy from Ivanka's designer handbag and brandished it like a trophy for the cameras. Most presidents surround themselves at such moments with representatives of various faith traditions. Trump stood alone. All presidents have at times appealed to religious symbolism in order to unite the republic and rally support for our democratic form of governance. Not Trump. Trump wielded the Bible as a weapon of division, and he aimed it squarely at the Constitution. This is not politics as usual. This is not merely pandering to the base. This is what religious nationalism looks like. Religious nationalism is fundamentally incompatible with modern constitutional democracy. It rejects equality and the idea of a just and pluralist society that our Constitution is meant to uphold. Religious nationalism divides us from them, the supposedly pure from the supposedly impure, and focuses the grievances of its base on demonic or dehumanized others. People keep asking how the religious right can continue to stand behind a leader like Trump, with his long history of doing and saying things that no so-called values voter should want to endorse. They say, well, why do they stand behind him? Why do they keep supporting him? You know, in fact, Trump's disdain for the rules is part of his appeal to this cohort. His transparently immoral character makes him the ideal leader of a religious nationalist state. He represents the lawlessness of the authoritarian, and he puts himself above the law, and is therefore representative of the authoritarian impulses of the leadership of this particular movement. An important point to note is that Christian nationalism in America is not really separable from race and racism, no matter how hard its leaders try to do so. Heads of the right-wing policy groups and their affiliated organizations, though many of the organizations that I focus so much on in my book, The Power Worshippers, you know, they're often trying to reach out to people of color and especially pastors of color in order to capture a subsection of voters of color. Like, for instance, they'll make a specialist effort with conservative Latino voters of faith in certain swing districts. But their success in this arena is limited, and the fact remains that for substantial numbers of white supporters of the movement, the idea of religious heritage and the idea of so-called Christian nation is closely bound up with ideas about racial heritage and racial difference. And of course, Christian nationalists are fighting the culture wars on behalf of a political party that has made race-based voter suppression and race-based gerrymandering a key part of their political strategy. This is how they win elections, by gerrymandering and gaming the vote. So when we think about the religious right, we're usually thinking about a cultural movement. I think a lot of people imagine it's about symbolic issues like crosses on public land, or social issues like abortion that have acquired extraordinary cultural significance and become almost markers of identity. When folks vote for the sort of hyper-conservative political candidates the movement favors, they're almost like voting their identity, not so much on the issues. But we're dealing with a political movement, not a cultural movement. It's about power. So Christian nationalism, as I'm going to explain, did not arise out of the abortion issue. It actually created the abortion issue in its quest for political power. The movement is a machine with many components. It includes right-wing policy groups, religious right policy groups, networking groups, media and legislative initiatives, legal and data organizations, and the like. Well, what do they want? A lot more power for themselves and their networks, and for the political leaders that they support. Many look forward to a time when only Christians in their approved versions of the religion, forget about the progressives, are in charge of all major areas of government and society and have to answer to their clerics. In addition to policies that privilege their religion, they're also looking forward to a time when they can rely on the government for a constant flow of taxpayer money. So let's talk a little bit about the machinery of the movement. I want to give you an example of how that machinery works through certain churches. So leaders of the movement have figured out that pastors drive votes, and they organize pastors into networks that sort of get them all on the same page politically. I want to give you an idea of what this looks like on the ground. Recently, I attended a pastors networking event at a church in rural North Carolina with dozens of evangelical pastors from the area. The event was aimed at teaching them how to communicate to their congregations the key issues that supposedly matter in elections and the biblically correct way to vote on them. The event was organized by Watchmen on the Wall, which is a project of the Family Research Council. Many of you have heard of them. They're one of the most powerful political policy groups of the Christian right. Watchmen on the Wall claims to have over 27,000 pastor members and has been openly endorsed by Republican political leaders including Vice President Mike Pence. So from the moment I stepped into the church, along with those pastors, I could tell this was clearly not a politically neutral affair. Family Research Council President Tony Perkins, who spoke at the event, said, "I believe this last election, 2016, was the result of prayer. We've seen our nation begin to move back to a nation that respects the sanctity of life." So what he's signaling here is that the single issue that matters most, the issue that pastors should, like this is their number one issue, is abortion. They know if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can get their vote. And then you can get them to vote in all these other policies that they might not even be aware of. So quoting from the book of Ephesians, Perkins told the pastors, "Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand the wiles of the devil." It was clear from his speech that the so-called wiles of the devil were on the Democratic side of the aisle. "The members of your congregations need to vote," Perkins told the pastors. He said, "As pastors, you need to tell them to vote." There wasn't the slightest doubt about which way Perkins expected pastors to tell their congregants to vote. Then pastors were instructed to form culture impact teams. The idea is for pastors to create within their churches teams of congregants that will, as they describe it, advance kingdom values in the public arena. I brought a guidebook that they actually handed out at this event. So pastors are instructed to figure out which members of their congregation are politically active, well connected with other members, and motivated to get them to vote according to their biblical values. And so they give them these tools for that. This is a culture impact team manual. You can see it's just really sophisticated document. It's not just a simple voter guide, although they had plenty of those on hand as well. It's got about 200 pages of tabbed instructions. So they're not just telling people to get out and vote and motivate other congregants to vote. They have all these resources and messaging materials to do it. They also aired some films at that event that they were telling pastors they could show their congregations in church. And there were, just pieces of political propaganda, essentially. They never said vote Republican, but they would, have eagles and flags and say vote your biblical values, the biblical values always boil down to 2 or 3 of these sort of so-called culture war issues. So a fundamental motivation behind these types of tools is to get around IRS guidelines that say pastors should refrain from campaigning for candidates from the pulpit. But nothing stops congregants from doing their own church-based political activism if it's all about the so-called culture. So several years ago, I spoke to a pastor about this type of initiative, and he called it a God-given loophole. He said the initiative threads a church and state loophole. So it's a sort of a way of getting around the law, sort of on a technicality in a way, while delivering a clear message about the so-called right way to vote. So now let me tell you something else about the political messaging of the movement leaders. When they're talking to congregants or talking to pastors about talking to the congregants, it's all abortion all the time. In fact, I heard one leader tell a group of Latino pastors, if someone asks you about the minimum wage, you ask them, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? I mean, when you put it that way, a couple extra bucks, and a fair minimum wage, a life, sort of, it seems to make the choice clear, doesn't it? But when you look at the political messages in more detail, and especially the messages they're sending to one another and to elites in power, it's not just about abortion. A lot of it is about money. It's about how the Bible supports tax policies that favor the rich, how the Bible supports minimal government or no government, unless the government is, of course, funding religious organizations, about how the Bible is against regulation of businesses and against a social safety net and even against environmental regulations. So let's talk a little bit about the ideology of the movement leaders, that sort of other layer of ideology that a lot of the rank and file is not as aware of, and it doesn't get as much press. I learned about a lot about that when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I went there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drallinger, the founder of Capital Ministries, who targets political leaders at the top levels of government. His weekly Bible study group in the Capitol has been attended by at least 12 current and former members of Trump's cabinet, including Alex Azar, Mike Pompeo, Vice President Mike Pence. He also has Bible study groups targeting the Senate and House of Representatives. Agricultural Secretary Sonny Perdue, Michelle Bachmann were among the many politicians on hand to deliver speeches and endorsements. So he is arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in America. Drallinger has this incredibly expansive range of positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy. And this hits home the fact that Christian nationalism is a political movement, not merely a stance in the so-called culture war. He weighs in on a number of social and economic policy questions, including the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in scripture. And his Bible study guides, which he teaches to political leaders, and by the way, you can look them up. He's not hiding any of this. They're online, I think, at his website, which is something like capmin.org. He writes, the responsibility to meet the needs of the poor lies first with a husband in a marriage, secondly with a family, if the husband is absent, and thirdly with the church. Nowhere does God command the institutions of government or commerce to fully support those with genuine needs. So he is, of course, against progressive income taxes, government regulation of businesses. He has referred to environmentalism as a false religion. There's a whole teaching about that. And he also has words of wisdom for laborers too. In a Bible study titled Toward a Better Biblical Understanding of Lawmaking, he cites from New Testament, first letter of Peter 2:18, servants be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. Wait, just listen to this. Servants be submissive to your masters, not only those who are good and gentle, but also those who are unreasonable. So it's a biblical passage, can be interpreted in many different ways, looked at in many different historical contexts. But here's what Drallinger has to say about it. He says, the economy of Rome at the time of Peter's writing was one of slave and master. The principle, however, of submitting to one's boss carries over to today. Now, this is all music to the ears of the movement's plutocratic funders, many of whom rely, I write about a number of these funders in my book, many of them belonging to extended hyper-wealthy families. Just offhand, I can think of the DeVos Prince family, the Green family, the family of Foster Friess, the Wilkes brothers, so many others. Many of them rely on minimal workers' rights and economic and environmental deregulation to maintain and increase their profits. This ideology, as I explain in my book, has roots in mid-century opposition to the New Deal. And even further back than that, there's a kind of through line with aspects of pro-slavery theology, the idea of America as a supposedly Christian nation, tasked with becoming an Orthodox Christian republic, rooted in hierarchies ordained by God. Some of these positions are parroted by other movement leaders today, including David Barton, one of my favorites. He's a historical revisionist. I call him the Where's Waldo of the movement because he sits on the board of so many of its initiatives. David Barton and Rob Boston has written an awful lot about, Rob Boston's written a lot about David Barton. I learned so much from him. Barton too has argued that the Bible and God oppose progressive income taxes, capital gains taxes, and minimum wage laws. And he exploits and distorts the issue of slavery too, to make his point. In an essay titled The Bible, Slavery, and America's Founders, he writes, different forms of slavery have replaced the more obvious system of past centuries. So he said, as Barton says, the state has assumed the role of master for many, providing with it aid and assistance, and with it more control to those unable to provide for themselves. The only solution to slavery is the liberty of the gospel. Now, if that sounds offensive to you, it's because it is. First of all, Barton, it seems to be attempting to de-racialize and whitewash, if it were, the explicitly racist institution of slavery in America, which is an incredibly offensive thing to do. He's actually casting the social safety net, things like job training and healthcare and food assistance, as a form of slavery. It's just wrong on so many levels. And by the way, I want to show you where it comes from. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the mid-century theologian Rusas John Rushdoony, who is a segregation apologist and a wildly influential theologian. I write about him in my book. He's sort of the godfather of a movement called Christian Reconstructionism. It's sort of one of the thinkers of the movement whose ideas continue to speak. There's this very influential, still, his words are still cited widely, even though some of his positions are sort of, should be embarrassing to the movement. So I want to show you what he wrote here. This is Rusas John Rushdoony. This is one of his like literally dozens of books. He wrote here, he's talking about, thus in a century's time, he says that Black people, quote, exchanged slavery to an individual for slavery to the state. In both conditions, there are advantages, this is what he wrote, but both constitute slavery. And I mean, it's just kind of extraordinary. And Barton actually is citing Rushdoony when he does his study about slavery. It's really kind of astonishing. Oh, here's another thing he says. Abolitionist leaders showed more hate than love on the whole. This is what Rusas John Rushdoony says, and this is a guy that Barton chooses to quote in his work. So I want to say that, you know, while many of these movement leaders are firmly against, you know, government assistance to the poor, they have no problem at all with government handouts and other free goodies to conservative religious organizations. The movement has learned to siphon public money through subsidies, tax donations, grants, vouchers, and other schemes. The role of public money is absolutely huge. The calls for religious freedom that characterize much of the movement's activism today, though undoubtedly bound up in a sincerely held belief that conservative Christians should be able to discriminate against LGBT Americans and others, are as loud and passionate as they are because movement leaders have their eyes trained not just on their existing subsidies, but also on a potential vast flow of public money in the future. This past winter, 8 federal agencies proposed changes in how they are going to work with religious organizations. They're substantially increasing the flow of public money to their groups in ways that allow them to continue to discriminate and proselytize on the taxpayer dime, all in the name of religious liberty. By the way, the government is now allowing federal pandemic aid to pay clergy salaries. This is a direct payment of our tax dollars to fund religion, something that would have been antithetical to the philosophies of the founders and would have been unthinkable in previous decades. So I want to very quickly explain a little more about how public subsidies are aiding the religious right by focusing on another aspect of my reporting, which is the data organizations, the role of the data organizations and how they aid in turning out the conservative Christian vote for, you know, in a very particular political direction. One of the right-wing data organizations I write about in my book, United in Purpose, uses special targeting to turn out voters for right-wing Republican candidates. They sort of figure out, you know, people's political leanings, whether they attend a conservative church or weekly church service, whether they're a fan of NASCAR or fishing or hunting, whether they've ever signed a sort of, you know, anti-marriage equality thing, you know, survey or something like that, or whether they've ever joined one of those anti-abortion lists. So it identifies a lot of these voters through church membership lists, membership in organizations like opposing marriage equality and the like. The founder of the organization, Bill Dallas, has not been shy at all in describing the massive reach of his data operation. In a 2016 interview, he said, "We've about 200 million files, so we have pretty much the whole voting population in our database. What we do is track to see what's going to make someone either vote one way or not vote at all." And listen to that. He said, what we do is we make sure we see what's going to make someone vote one way or not vote at all. And they're using specialized targeting information to do this. United in Purpose has a large number of initiatives. In the interest of time, I'll just describe one of them. Project 75 is a pastor-focused initiative which aims at turning out larger and larger numbers of church members to vote. The program features a church voter lookup tool, which provides reports to a pastor on what percentage of the congregation is registered to vote, what percentage actually voted in the last election. And then after each election, they give pastors a follow-up report to track progress. So a pastor can say, I got 73% of my congregation to vote in the last election. I got to do better this time. And then there's even a tool called I think called something like an individual voter lookup, which allows pastors to check and see whether a particular individual member of his congregation voted. So you can imagine the conversations that might happen after that. Mrs. Jones, I noticed you didn't vote in the last election. Don't you know that voting is your, biblical responsibility? So in 2016, United in Purpose was at the epicenter of a dense network of faith-based initiatives aimed at turning out conservative Christians for Trump and Pence. Now, of course, all political operations on all ends of the political spectrum rely on data and activist networks to sharpen their effectiveness in election campaigns. That's not new, but United in Purpose's voter turnout machine is at the top of a long pyramid that largely operates in the religious sphere, almost all of which is exempt from taxes and shielded from public scrutiny. Now I want to shift a little bit from discussing some of the Get Out the Vote initiatives to talking about one of the movement's key legislative initiatives that AU's been so instrumental in trying to make people aware of, and that's Project Blitz. I'm sure some of you listeners are familiar with the organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council and ALEC. Well, or maybe Americans United for Life, which is an anti-abortion organization. These organizations craft pieces of model legislation that allow legislators to easily introduce bills in different states without needing to research and write the bills themselves. These types of model legislation get everyone with the same political vision on the same page. And they're just an incredible efficiency for them. Project Blitz works along similar lines. The idea is to overwhelm state legislatures with so many religiously oriented bills that some of those bills can be expected to get through, and then the center of debate gets shifted to the right. So the key item on the agenda is to secure a license for certain faith groups to discriminate against other groups, like LGBT Americans, for instance, and conflate in the minds of the public one variety of religion with the authority of the government. It's really a way of signaling to everybody through the law that there is a group that is rightly privileged in our society, the truly American group that believes rightly, and other groups are not deserving of that privilege. You know, sometimes when these bills, but they do it in all these different ways, and there are 3 levels of how they want to introduce these bills into the state legislatures, starting with the easiest, like the In God We Trust bills. People can say, oh, what's the harm of letting putting in God We Trust signs in all of our public schools, allowing outside groups to do that. But the architects of Project Blitz, including David Barton, by the way, understand that it's kind of a slippery slope. The point of phase 1 of these bills is to clear the way for phase 2. So, you know, sometimes when these bills come in through the states, we, and even state legislators, look at them in a siloized fashion. We think, what's the harm of this little bill? It's, you know, not that big a deal. But in fact, they're pieces of a larger puzzle. And the Project Blitz architects know that very well. They make it explicit in the playbook that they published about this. They show, this sort of initiative shows that the Christian right understands these bills not only relate to one another, but they also further a broader Christian nationalist political vision. The rise of Christian nationalism should alarm all of us who care about the future of democracy in America, but it should not be the cause of despair. Overcoming this kind of reactionary and authoritarian movement isn't just something Americans can do. It is what has made Americans who we are. We are seeing a lot more political engagement today than we saw 5 or 6 years ago. but you simply can't affect political change without winning elections. There is no substitute for the power of the vote. The religious right knows that. I remember at one of the right-wing conferences I attended, Ralph Reed, the head of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, said, you know, all that matters is who turns out on election day. He actually was referring to polls showing that the numbers of Christian nationalists, the most sort of hardcore believers, is shrinking in our society. He said, pay no attention to the polls. Our membership is shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. They turn people out in disproportionate numbers. And that's how they win. And we have to do that too, those of us who oppose the politics of division and conquest that the movement represents. And we can, as Ralph Reed said, we can't allow ourselves to be comforted by polls. One mistake people make on this topic is that they assume that majority rules in a country like the United States. It doesn't. In a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, and an additional number are disenfranchised through race-based gerrymandering, voter suppression, and other kinds of dirty tricks that we've been seeing, you don't need a majority to win elections. All you need is a very committed minority to access the levers of power. The challenges we face today are political, and so the solutions are political too. The right has invested in all the tools of modern campaign infrastructure, data, media, and messaging. These tools are available to all those who oppose the politics of division and conquest that the movement represents, who defend the separation of church and state, a principle upon which all of our freedoms are depending these days, and the balance is hanging right now. Let's take our values to the ballot box and hold others accountable to vote their values too. Religious nationalists are using the tools of democratic political culture to end democracy. Those same resources can be used to restore it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katherine. As always, that was enlightening as well as disturbing. And I appreciate your filling us in on so much of what's going on right now in the political system. Let's take a look at some questions. We've had a number come in, and I'm just going to pull some of these up here, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the time we have left. First questioner wants to know how you would respond to someone who is in fact skeptical of the existence and power of religious right groups within the government. Are they really as strong as people say they are? I mean, certainly you've written a book about this, so what do you say?
Well, I say, first of all, read my book. Sometimes I've covered at great length the folks that are involved in these different organizations, the folks that have been empowered in Trump's America. I think also, you know, if you want to find out how much power they have, just look at the 2016 election. Trump would not have won without the support of this cohort, and he will do everything in his power to maintain their support. They turned out, the right wing sort of turn out the vote machine is largely operating in that sort of religious sphere. And, you know, I've been attending for over 10 years religious right conferences, strategy gatherings, and meetings, and have really learned a lot about that sort of get out the vote machine. I've seen so many different initiatives. The amount of money they bring to bear on the elections is quite extraordinary. So yeah, be skeptical and read my book and learn about the movement and its and the key personalities behind it.
Next question. You mentioned the tax code a couple of times during your remarks and the tax status that these groups hold. Is there any way that we could change the tax code to reduce or neutralize the power of these organizations?
Well, one doesn't have the ability to make meaningful legislative changes without having the key people in place in order to do it. I mean, a political problem requires political solutions, and it's one of the reasons why, you know, if you support separation of church and state and you want to maintain the justification for the tax exemptions and multiple privileges that religious organizations have. And the idea is that they have all these privileges, and yet they're supposed to stay free and clear of government institutions and not politic from the pulpit. Then you need to put the right leaders in office, and then you can't enact any kind of legislative change without putting in legislators who believe in the principles of church-state separation.
Our next question concerns Capital Ministries, which you mentioned. This viewer is wondering if there's any connection between that organization and the family. And I'm just going to expand that question a little bit and ask you what you think about the role that the family, the Fellowship Foundation, may play in this. A lot of people have been putting renewed emphasis on that organization in light of Jeff Sharlett's book and the subsequent Netflix documentary series. So what can you tell us about the family?
The family is a really interesting organization. There's no better authority to discuss it than Jeff Sharlett, who wrote the book, The Family. It's a fairly, secretive organization, but I didn't find in my research a direct overlap, although there may be stuff that I haven't seen and I'm not aware of. But the thing about Ralph Drallinger's ministry targeting political leaders at the highest levels of power is that it's not really that hidden. I mean, obviously we can't go to those Bible study groups in the nation's capital, but he does put his, we know a number of the people who are part of his ministry because they appear endorsing his, in his own marketing materials, offering full-throated endorsements. They speak at his events. And we also see his Bible studies. He posts them online so we can see what his ideology is that these folks are endorsing.
The next question is a bit of an historical one, which you touched on in your remarks, and that is how the religious right assumed so much control of the Republican Party. Some of us are old enough to remember a Republican Party that was not always in the grip of religious conservatives, and some of us can think about history we've read with so-called Eisenhower Republicans and other types of Republicans who really weren't so much interested in these social issues. How did this faction gain so much control within this party?
It's a really interesting question, a really terrific question. There was a group called the New Right. It was a sort of a group of conservatives, hyper-conservatives, including Paul Weyrich, Howard Phillips, Phyllis Schlafly, Jerry Falwell. There were a number of them. They were really unhappy with the direction that the culture was going. They felt like the Rockefeller Republicans were being too soft on communism, embracing things like progressive forms of religion. They were just kind of wanted to ignite a hyper-conservative counter-revolution. They called themselves the New Right. And they were actually radicals. I think it was Weyrich who said, we were radicals. We don't want to maintain the existing status quo. We want change. We are the forces of change. And they got together and sort of were talking about issues that they could use to unite conservative. Let's remember at the time, okay, most Republican Protestants supported some form of abortion law liberalization. Let's just sort of keep this in the background. So this group of folks got together, they had a number of meetings and tried to find an issue that they could use to ignite this hyper-conservative counter-revolution. There were a lot of issues. They were really preoccupied with the issue of prayer in schools and public education. They were really unhappy with that. They were really unhappy with the women's rights movement. They were really, really unhappy with the civil rights movement. They were really incredibly, if there's one issue that really bothered them, it was the fact that the IRS was starting to take, to look askance at what they call segregation academies, these sort of segregated religious schools that a lot of these sort of hyper-conservative pastors were involved with. But they knew that stop the tax on segregation wasn't really going to be a very appealing message. and wasn't going to be able to inspire a hyper-conservative counter-revolution. So they sort of went down a number of issues. And when they got to the issue of abortion, a light bulb sort of clicked on, and they were like, huh, that could work. And so over time, because it united conservative, hyper-conservative, conservative Protestants who are against abortion, conservative Catholics, like to have an issue that united Protestants and Catholics became incredibly valuable to them. So over time, again, as I mentioned, at the time, the Republican Party in general favored some form of abortion law liberalization. I want to tell you a little bit about that, not to go down a rabbit hole, but I think it's really important to understanding the politics of today. So when Roe versus Wade was passed, the Southern Baptist Convention actually hailed the decision. They had affirmed some form of abortion rights several times in their different declarations. Remember, Ronald Reagan signed the most liberal abortion law when he was governor of California in 1967. Even folks like Barry Goldwater, that great conservative hero, supported abortion law liberalization, and his wife, Peggy, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Betty Ford hailed Roe v. Wade as a great, great decision. But over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party because this sort of cohort of hyper-conservatives really wanted to take the party in a different direction. And they knew if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can capture and control their vote. And they did this, and that's one of the key moments that's sort of uniting around the issue of abortion that really formed the foundation of the kind of radicalism that we're seeing in today's Christian right.
Thank you. This next question, a couple of people have asked this in different ways. You, in the book, you're at these events, and of course, during your remarks, you talked about this too, going to a pastor's briefing and other types of events. How do you get away with that? And what type of reaction do you get when you're there?
Well, I just go places where people are allowed to go. Anybody can purchase a ticket for a Values Voters Summit or a Road to Majority Summit. Anybody can attend a March for Life. I have, people in the movement who actually know that I'm an opposition journalist and have still invited me to engage. For instance, I wrote a piece about Jim Doman, who's a leader of a sort of pastors network, hyper-conservative pastors network in California called Church United. I wrote a piece about him, and he called me up and he was like, oh, that was a great piece. Even though he knew as an opposition journalist, he said that I got the details right, I got the facts right. And then he invited me to attend an event out in California. I have engaged with other sort of leaders, various leaders at various times. And then, a lot of the stuff is like Ralph Drallinger. I did go to his this gathering, but a lot of his materials are online. He's not hiding. The thing is, this is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies happen under the cover of darkness and with unnamed actors. This is all happening out in the open. It's not that they're hiding, it's that we're not listening.
This next question touches on the issue of taxes again. Organizations that hold tax-exempt status are not supposed to be partisan, not overtly political. Do you think any of these organizations that you have studied may actually be violating the law?
I don't want to accuse any particular organizations of violating the law, but I have certainly heard speech at different events that are tax exempt that are like a clear endorsement of one political party over another, or a clear endorsement of one candidate over another.
This next question actually might be something more for a theologian, but let's see what you have to say about it anyway. This viewer makes the point that the Bible really speaks to a lot of social justice issues: care for the poor, those in need, the need to give charity, to forgive, to be a decent person. How is it that so many Americans have accepted this other version of the Bible that reflects right-wing views that don't seem to be in the text?
That's a great question, and about theology, and it really gets at kind of a tensions that have always existed within different, among different interpretations of the Christian faith, and I think that different interpretations probably of every faith. Let's not forget that abolitionists argued for the abolition of slavery from pulpits and used the words of the Bible, theological arguments to make their case. But as Frederick Douglass himself pointed out, it was the well-resourced, the richest and most well-connected pastors in the South who were actually arguing the point of the slaveholder, and they had either either made their peace with slavery. Most wealthy pastors in the South at that time, not the abolitionists, but the pro-slavery theologians, they had either made their peace with slavery, or they were some of them actively promoted it and said it was part of God's established order. So that's it's a tension that's always existed. I mean, if you think about somebody like Martin Luther King, he argued from pulpits, of course, that segregation was wrong, and he relied heavily on church organizations to spread his messages, and he used religious references to give them authority. We should acknowledge, though, that he made use of the churches in part because the people he sought to represent, in particular people of color, were radically underrepresented and in fact shut out of every other structure in American society and politics. So I think that the use of religious messages can either unite or divide. They can either fight for equality, pluralism, or they can argue for sort of hierarchies of value. And these conflicts have happened over time in America, and certainly probably in every other religion.
A similar question actually has come in that kind of dovetails nicely with that last one, and that is the question of if some folks who are of a more progressive bent will also point to the Bible when they're buttressing their particular perspectives. We've heard people argue, for example, against the death penalty, and they'll cite the Bible. We've had people argue for greater funding for social programs and welfare programs, and they will cite the Bible. And this is always a very difficult question. You've touched on this already, but maybe you could say a little more. How do we balance that? An individual's particular religious perspective coming into the public arena, politician, and so on, in a pluralistic, multi-faith society with a secular government, how do we balance that?
It's really interesting. I can't speak certainly to the merits of these different sort of theologies, but I can talk about how the relationship of religion and government has shifted over time. And what we are seeing today is a conflation of a very particular religious viewpoint with the authority of the government, and we should oppose that. That is religious nationalism. Look, the separation of church and state isn't just a sort of a technicality, and it's not something that's just for non-religious people. It's a principle that has served all Americans, religious and non-religious, over time. And I think it's something that we should defend. It's a principle that we should defend.
This next question raises the fact we've all seen reported after the Trump election that 81% of white evangelicals voted for him. This questioner is asking if there's much support in the Black evangelical community for Christian nationalism and the types of things that you've been discussing this afternoon.
A really interesting question. I would say percentage-wise, there's more support within certain Latino groups, although at the same time, it's still like a relatively small proportion. I want to note that, in recent years, the movement has made a significant effort to reach out to, I think I mentioned this in my talk, pastors of color, in order to capture certainly a subsection of their votes. I think some of the leaders are also really engaged in what they call, racial reconciliation efforts, and eager to kind of guard themselves against accusations of racism in the present, and kind of because they're so susceptible to it, given but what how the movement has engaged in the past. But in a way, it's just shifting it's just shifting the lines between outsider and insider, pure and impure. And it appears to be that very few Black voters of faith are buying it. I think the fact is most sort of hyper-conservative white Trump voters can be considered sort of going along with this movement, at least on a sort of, there may be Christian nationalist in a sort of loose way, that is, they sort of agree with the idea, yes, America is a so-called Christian nation, the data appears to show that the movement is not making very strong inroads among Black voters of faith.
This next question looks at the term religious nationalism, which is in the subtitle of your book, Religious Nationalism, although you've used the term Christian nationalism a lot this afternoon, and people do use that term more commonly. There is in other non-Christian faiths usually a faction of very conservative folks who would be considered anti-feminist, anti-gay. You see that in some strange of Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, small factions in some of these faiths, but nevertheless they are out there. Are you seeing any effort to kind of merge all of those together, or are the Christian nationalists really sort of wary of some of these non-Christian faiths, even if they may share some of their social views?
It's interesting. It's a really, really great question. You see in some of the, you see there, you know, the Christian right is often talking about, they also often talk about the, you know, the country's quote unquote Judeo-Christian roots. I think that there's an appeal to Christian Zionism is important to some of them because it's part of their theology among some subsection of the movement. But, you know, when they talk about America as a so-called Christian nation, they're being pretty explicit about the idea that, you know, a certain understanding of their religion is a sort of correct faith, and other religious groups are sort of here by invitation only.
Here's an important question. You've outlined this threat very succinctly. What is the first step we can take to respond?
Well, I think voting really matters, you know, and one thing that the right does right is they really, the sort of religious right does right, and is really get out, they create a positive voting culture. I mean, they make people feel no matter, you know, whether they're, how young they are, how old they are, whether they're disabled, good health, bad health, it doesn't matter, your vote matters. You know, they really impress that message upon their sort of true believers. And they don't sort of, you know, preoccupy themselves too much with the peccadillos, as we can see, you know, not just peccadillos, but, you know, they've really stood behind a leader who's so transparently immoral that, you know, they're not obsessing about something he might have done in 1982 or something he might have said in 1996. They're willing to overlook all of it, you know, in pursuit of their goals. So, you know, voting really matters, not just holding yourself accountable to vote, but also holding those in your circle to get and vote. Progressive or the values of church-state separation, that's really important. And then again, you know, I sort of feel like if everyone would just do like one level up from what they did the last time, you know, we could, you know, have leadership that respects the separation of church and state.
A bit of a follow-up here. Sometimes candidates run under the cover of stealth. They may not be really willing to talk about all of their views. Are there questions we can ask to sort of smoke out the Christian nationalist out there?
That's a really good question. And I have seen some of that. And I've even overheard in some of the gatherings I've attended, conversations around that. Like I heard a conversation among two men, and one was like, we need a young woman of color who is technically a Democrat, but like has, you know, votes like a Republican. I'm like, what? It's like they're talking about grooming a person to run for a particular position, a particular district. That was pretty wild. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for recognizing that that does happen. I always think you can, just ask deeper questions, look into the way people have voted in different ways in the past, different kind of, look at their voting record, look where they come out of. I'm not sure there's one particular question. I have to think about that, whether there's a handful of questions one might ask.
This is something you've touched on as well, and I'm curious as to what you may think about this. A viewer is asking, to what extent do you think Christian nationalist groups embrace racism either overtly or subvertly as part of their agenda?
I think that the racism among much of the movement is really kind of implicit rather than explicit. I mean, look, obviously, if you're talking about if you look at the Venn diagram of the Christian right and the alt-right, there's some overlap there, but it's not the same thing. And I think there are a lot of leaders of the movement would be absolutely horrified by any kind of overt racism that was expressed in their name. But there is obviously a lot of overlap. I think, we can't separate out the idea that, the idea of religious Christian nationalism in the United States is tying the idea of America to distinct cultural identities, religious and cultural identities, and often that's implicit in that are ideas about race and racial difference.
Okay, as the moderator, I'm going to take the prerogative of the final question. And that is this. Lately, there has been some polling data that indicates that white evangelical support for President Trump might actually be starting to slip. Do you think there's anything to this?
I can't see into the future as much. Wish I could, but it's possible that his approval ratings are slipping. But again, I don't think we should allow ourselves to be comforted by the polls. What really matters is whether they can turn out the right vote in the right swing districts in order to win those elections. It's funny, Ralph Reed talks about it as the Republican reapportionment advantage. That's what he calls sort of gerrymandering and voter trickery. He said, he was at a breakfast where he said, if Democrats are 1 to 3 points up, we win because of the Republican reapportionment advantage. If they're up 4 to 7 points, it's a jump ball. Think about that. And then he said, if they're up 8 points or more, that's when they win. So that's how much more, a Democrat would need to win. I think that's, and he said the Republican reapportionment advantage in a sort of very matter-of-fact way, as though, he's talking about.
That's got to be the mother of all euphemisms.
Exactly.
Amazing statement. Kathryn, thank you so much for your insight today and joining us. This was incredibly interesting, and I know from the questions we had, we tried to get to as many as we could, that people were very interested in what you had to say. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah, did you want to talk about next week's?
Thank you to Rob and to Kathryn for such an exciting conversation and so incredibly timely in this moment that we're in our country. Next week, please join us again, same time, same place, where we'll be featuring AU's own Dr. Sabrina Dent on the subject of religious freedom as a social justice issue. She'll be joined by Victoria Hamilton, who's a member of a Buddhist lay organization, Tahil Sharma, who works for North America for United Religions Initiative, and also Charles Watson Jr. From our partner organization, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. So we'll look forward to seeing you next week at 3 p.m. Eastern or 12 p.m. Pacific, and look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you so much, Kathryn. Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining us.